The third record used the same phrase. Yva Shan had been in the Tessarith repository for 6 hours when she found it, and she had not been looking for it. She had been cataloging medical incident reports from the Karath, human contact period, a dense, underfiled block of 200 years' worth of documentation that her department had agreed to integrate into the Joint Diplomatic Archive. The work was indexing and tagging. She was supposed to flag entries for senior review, not conduct the review herself. But she had flagged the first phrase, and then she had found the second, and now the third was sitting in a report filed 3 days ago, and Yva was no longer indexing anything. She read the line again. Left a small folded paper shape on the counter, unable to classify. Retained in Station Evidence Archive. The report was from Waystation Hevith 9, filed by a port security officer named Laz Orven. The incident it described was a bureaucratic lockdown, a transit permit dispute that had trapped a group of Velhari refugees in the Waystation's processing ring for 11 days. The lockdown had resolved unexpectedly that morning. A human courier, a young woman named Myra Cass who had been stranded at the same station, had located a procedural gap in the permit code and submitted a batch correction that released all 17 refugees simultaneously. The security officer's note was 2 paragraphs, a summary of the resolution, and the detail about the folded paper shape. Yva pulled up the first record. The medical log was dated 203 years ago, from a station called Karath Outpost 7, a name that no longer existed, absorbed into what was now the Kashin Station complex. The log had been filed by a human medic named Sira Akafar, 24 years old by the entry's header, stationed alone at the outpost when Karath bombardment had forced a 3-week shelter period. She had tended 9 patients, 4 humans, 3 Velhari, 2 Karath who had chosen shelter over retreat. The log was detailed. It described medications, wound assessments, the rationing of medical supplies down to single doses, the improvisation of a pressure bandage from hull patch material. It read with the particular plainness of someone writing to stay focused, not to be read. Toward the end of each patient entry, without comment or explanation, Akafar had noted, left paper fold on patient's chest while sleeping. Not every entry. The first 3 did not have it. Then entry 4, a Velhari named Iran with a fractured arm, had the note in the margin, and every patient after Iran had it. Yva had flagged it because the paper fold appeared to have no medical function. It was not a note, not a marker, not a dosage reminder. It was just there. The log did not explain it, and in the 6 days before rescue arrived, Akafar had written nothing about it. It simply appeared in the records, unexplained, the way a habit appears unremarkable to the person who has it. She pulled up the second record. The survivor testimony was from 61 years ago. It was part of the Merit Colony Incident Archive, the collapse of a generation ship that had failed to complete its transit and been abandoned mid-crossing. 412 people had boarded escape pods. 401 had reached the relay station alive. The 11 who had not were crew members who had stayed to ensure pod launches. The testimony had been given by a Velhari woman named San Ev, who had been on the colony ship as a registered passenger. She was 19 at the time of the incident. Her statement described the pod launch in clinical, careful terms, the failure alarms, the corridors, the sequence of events. Near the end, she had mentioned a human dock worker named Tamaz Wren, 20 years old, who had guided her to a pod bay when the main routing system failed. He had taken her arm, walked her through 3 wrong turns in corridors that were already losing pressure, and put her in a pod. Before he sealed it, she said, he had tucked something into her hand. She described it as a small folded paper object, like a bird. She had been holding it when the pod reached the relay station. She had kept it for 11 years before including it with her testimony as a physical exhibit. The exhibit was still catalogued. Yva cross-referenced. It was archived in the Merit Incident Physical Collection at a facility 3 systems away. She read San Ev's closing line twice. I asked a record keeper once what it meant. She said humans folded paper when they were afraid. I have thought about that for many years. I do not believe Tamaz Ren was afraid. Yva sat with that for a moment. Then she pulled up the HFY 9 report again. The security officer's note about Myra Cass was brief. The young woman had arrived at HFY 9 7 days before the lockdown resolved, on a standard courier transit from the outer relay. When the lockdown trapped the Velhari refugees in the processing ring, she had apparently spent most of the following 6 days in the station's public records terminal, cross-referencing permit codes. She was not employed by any legal office. She was not authorized to submit batch corrections. The security officer's note acknowledged a degree of ambiguity about how she had obtained submission credentials, then moved past it with the dry resignation of someone who had reviewed the outcome and decided not to press the question. The 17 refugees had been released at 06:14 station time. Myra Cass had departed on the first outbound transit at 07:00. At some point between those two events, she had left a folded paper shape on the information desk in the processing ring. The security officer had retrieved it as a matter of protocol. Unidentified objects had to be logged, and had found it to be a small piece of paper folded into an angular shape with no apparent function. He had described it in 3 words: 4-pointed compressed center. Yva looked at those 3 words for a long time. The medical log from 200 years ago had not described the paper fold shape, but the physical exhibit from the Merit testimony had. It was included in the exhibit note as a catalog descriptor: 4-pointed, compressed center, creases consistent with repeated folding. She checked the date on the HFY 9 report again. 3 days ago. This was not archive material. The paper fold was currently sitting in an evidence locker at a way station 4 light towers from Tessarith repository. She sent a records request to the HFY 9 evidence archive before she had fully decided to. The request took 4 hours to process, which was faster than she expected. The station's archive officer confirmed that the item was available for transfer to a recognized institutional repository. The transfer would take 11 days via standard courier. In the meantime, Yva kept working. She was not supposed to keep working on this. She was supposed to flag the entries and move on. But the flagging queue was hers to manage, and the records were all legitimately in her block, and there was a second thing that was beginning to bother her that had nothing to do with paper. All 3 records involved a waiting period, not metaphorically, literally. HFY had waited 6 days for rescue with 9 patients and no reinforcements. Ren had waited in a failing ship for everyone else to board pods before he did. Cass had waited 7 days in a transit lockdown that was not her problem, not her responsibility, not her bureaucratic category. None of them had been asked to wait. None of them had been required to. They had simply been present, and something had needed doing, and they had stayed. Yva pulled up the biographical records for all 3. HFY had survived, returned to medical service, and worked as a field medic for another 30 years. Ren had not survived the Merit incident. He was among the 11 crew who had missed the last pod. Cass was 22 years old and listed as a freelance courier, no institutional affiliation, currently in transit between HFY 9 and an outer relay. She looked at the 3 files open on her screen for a while. There was a version of this that was coincidence. Humans folded paper. Many humans folded paper. The gesture might have no more connection than a shared cultural habit, the way many species carried water or made fire. She could write up a 3-paragraph note for senior review, flag the phrases as potential shared cultural documentation, and go back to indexing. She started writing the note. She got 2 sentences in and stopped. The thing that stopped her was San Ev's line: "I do not believe Tamaz Ren was afraid." The Velhari woman had sat with that thought for 11 years before submitting her testimony. She had kept the paper bird for 11 years. She had included it as a physical exhibit, which required a specific form and a notarized statement, which was not something you did casually. It was something you did when you believed an object was evidence of something, and you wanted the record to carry it. Yva had been trained to read records the way other people were trained to read numbers, not just for what they said, but for what they were doing by existing. A record that kept something for 11 years and then formally submitted it was a record that had been waiting for someone to find it. She finished the note and sent it to senior review. Then she opened a separate working file and began pulling everything she could find about the paper fold gesture in human cultural documentation. There was more than she expected. It appeared in casualty records, field logs, aid station inventories, refugee intake reports, always peripheral, always parenthetical, never the subject. A maintenance technician who had repaired a broken heating unit for a Velhari family and left a small folded paper square on the housing. A human child in a transit camp who had pressed folded paper into the hands of other children during a disease quarantine. An engineer on a deep survey vessel who had folded paper during a 3-week communications blackout and left the shapes in the common area, one per day, though no one had asked him to and no log explained why. The instances spanned 80 years. They appeared on 4 different station clusters, 2 planet surfaces, and 3 ship classes. None of the humans involved had any documented connection to each other. None of them had described what they were doing or why. None of them had been asked. That was the pattern Yva was looking at, not the paper fold. The paper fold was the visible marker, the thing that had made the pattern findable. What the pattern actually described was something else. Humans who were present in a situation that called for something, and who responded not with a required action but with an unrequired one. The medic who stayed through 6 days of bombardment. The dock worker who took the wrong turns to find the right pod bay. The courier who spent 6 days reading permit code she had no obligation to read. The paper fold was what they left behind. It was small. It fit in a hand. It could be carried 11 years in a pocket or 3 days in an evidence locker without deteriorating, and it had no function that any record had ever been able to classify. Yva looked up at the repository's skylight, a long horizontal strip of pale morning light that ran the length of the archive hall. The hall was quiet. The other analysts had gone to their rest shifts 2 hours ago. She had the light and the records and the working file open on her terminal. She wrote, "The gesture does not appear to be ceremonial. It does not appear communicative in any conventional sense. It appears in contexts of extended waiting, prolonged difficulty, and unrecognized effort. It leaves no message. It is not addressed to anyone." She stopped. Then she wrote, "It is possible that the gesture is addressed to the situation itself, that the folded paper is not a gift but a record, a physical note that says, 'I was here, I stayed, I saw this matter through,' left for no one or for anyone who finds it." She read that line back. Then she added, "The humans documented here did not know each other. They lived in different eras, on different routes, in different circumstances. The gesture connecting them was not taught. It was not inherited in any documented form. It appears to have been arrived at independently, in each case, at the point where the situation became difficult enough that leaving was the easier option." She saved the file. The paper fold from HFY 9 arrived 11 days later. Yva signed the courier manifest herself. The item was sealed in a standard evidence bag, a small square of white paper folded into a 4-pointed shape, the creases tight and deliberate, a compressed center that had been pinched and then released. It was light in her hand. It was very small. She set it on her desk beside the evidence photograph from the Merit Testimony Archive, a printed image of another paper fold, 61 years old. its creases softer with time but the shape identical. Same 4 points. Same compressed center. Same weight, she suspected, though the photograph gave no mass. She looked at the two of them for a while. Somewhere between HFY 9 and the outer relay, Myra Cass was carrying nothing. She had left this behind without a second thought, or perhaps with a second thought, with exactly the consideration required and no more. The 17 refugees in the processing ring were already in transit. Their permits were in order. The paper fold was in an evidence bag in a repository on a station she would never visit. Yva found that she was not surprised by this. She had read enough of the record now to understand that this was how the gesture worked. You folded the paper, you left it, and you moved on. You did not wait to see what happened to it. She placed the HFY 9 fold and the photograph side by side in the physical evidence drawer she had opened for the file. Then she returned to her terminal and added a final line to the working document. She was recommending the file for preservation as a cross-era cultural continuity record. The detail, a 4-pointed folded paper shape left at the site of an unrequired act, appeared across 203 years of documentation, in unconnected individuals, in unconnected circumstances. No teaching mechanism had been identified. No transmission route had been identified. The humans had not shared this with each other. They had shared it with whoever found it afterward. She saved the file. She sent it to senior review with the subject line, 3 records, same mark, no connection found. Then she went to the skylight and stood under the morning light for a while, not thinking about anything in particular. The repository was quiet around her, and the evidence drawer was closed, and somewhere on an outbound courier route, a young woman named Myra Cass was doing whatever came next, the same as she always had, the same as 2 strangers 200 years and 60 years before her had done. None of them had needed to stay. All of them had